Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. We just finished Easter, so it's been very busy, so I'm a little bit behind in recording review videos, but I've got one for you today. Today I want to talk about Botany for Gardeners. This is the third edition of this book, written by Brian Capon. This book is now in its fourth edition. I picked it up a number of years ago when they only had the third edition out. So it has been around for quite a while. First published in 1990. The version I have here is 2005. And then a couple years ago, they redid a fourth edition. So it has been around for a long time. And after reading it, I can definitely understand why. Brian Capon is a professor of botany. He's taught in both England and America, and wrote this book to explain kind of the science of botany for those who are not necessarily going to be professional full-time botanists. I think this grew out of a course that he would teach that was on botany for, kind of undergrads to take. And so he really spent a lot of time thinking through, how do you break this down and communicate it to people who aren't going to use this as a launch pad to go further, but this may be the only kind of formal botanical training that they have. And you can definitely tell that that teacher's heart comes out in the book, because he does explain things very well. He does a good job of introducing you to terminology and things, so it's not like it's so dumbed down that you couldn't go read botanical literature after this, but it's also taking the time to explain what those terms mean and give lots of wonderful graphics and pictures and high quality things, and it's just broken down into very digestible pieces. So that's really what the aim of the book is to give kind of a crash course on botany for those of us who aren't going to be botanists. And specifically, he has in mind the home gardener, right? So someone who enjoys plants, enjoys growing plants, but has never really studied the science of botany themselves. So that's what this book is designed to do. It's kind of like a one semester course in about 250 pages. This is put out by Timber Press, part of their Science for Gardeners series. I really enjoyed this book, and that's saying something, because in school, my two least favorite subjects were science and math. Well, math was my least favorite. Science was kind of the second. Since then, I've sort of repented of my dislike of those things, but I haven't really had the chance to study, or taken the chance, I should say, to study those things more myself. So in one sense, I'm the perfect person to review this book, because I am not a botanist by training. I'm not a scientist by training or by personality. I'm very much a liberal arts person, and yet I really enjoyed this book. And so I think if you're someone who enjoys plants and likes reading, you can work through this book, and it can be very profitable for you. So in that sense, I'm the perfect person to review this book. In another sense, I'm not the best person to review this book, because someone who actually is a botanist, or at least a horticulturalist or something, would have more expertise to say, to assess, the substance of the book. I can't really do that. This is the book I wrote on botany, so, it's the exposure that I have. But the fact that it's in now its fourth edition, I think itself says that it's something that has proven to be valuable by those who are familiar with the science. So just a couple of things I'll mention here very briefly. Again, this is probably a book that for some people it'll be just exactly your niche, and it'll be very profitable. For others, maybe it'll be less of interest. But just to kind of orient you to what he walks through, he basically breaks down the whole book is divided into 10 chapters and broken into 5 sections. So each section has 2 chapters. So that does a good job of giving you the overview, but he moves through it pretty quickly as well. So he just starts off by talking about growth. How do plants grow? So he gets into cells and meristems and root growth, and how a plant absorbs nutrients, all of that. Organization, what's going on inside the stems, what's going on inside the roots and the leaves, and he kind of walks through the different aspects of that. Adaptation, so dealing a lot with how plants protect themselves or defend themselves, and the evolutionary development of plants. I'll say something more about that in just a moment. And then functions. How do plants control their growth and development? How do they use water, minerals, light, all of that? And then the last part is reproduction. So flowers and fruits, and then kind of he ends with a chapter on genetics. So overall, just kind of looking at the book as a whole, I thought he explained things really well. I could follow him. There was a lot of just fascinating things about the different kinds of plants. And again, one of the benefits of reading from a botanist is that he's not just looking at the plants we grow in our backyard. He's looking at, plants throughout the world. And so he'll draw out, just these really wonderful examples and illustrations from the various flora and fauna that we have. Really, really interesting stuff. But then also he has an eye towards the home gardener, so he'll say, hey, this is what's going on in your cucumber plant that you're growing in your backyard. And so that was a good kind of combination of something that felt very practical, but also very interesting and engaging. So I thought he explained things well. Nothing felt belabored. The one chapter I struggled with was the very last chapter, which is Strategies of Inheritance. This is all about genetics of plants, this last chapter. When I read it, I was really struggling to follow it. I felt like there was a lot more jargon, and that could be for one of two reasons. One, I did read it when I was kind of tired, so it might just have been a reader error there. I also did not remember much from my kind of high school study of genetics and things, and it felt like he assumed, okay, you've got that fresh in your mind. Now let me explain how this works for plants. And it wasn't fresh in my mind, so it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Again, both of those are kind of user error things, but that chapter felt a little bit less accessible than some of the other chapters had. Having said that, it was the last chapter, so maybe he was sort of trying to build us up and push us along. So not necessarily a criticism, but just something I experienced reading through it. Last thing I'll mention is the way that evolution features in this book. So this is a book written by a secular scientist. I am a Christian pastor, so reading about anything in the field of biology, evolution always comes up. I'm not going to do a whole video on evolution, but there was a couple things that just jumped out at me reading this book, and I'll just put my cards on the table and say that largely for exegetical and theological reasons, although also for scientific reasons as well, as far as I understand them. I don't pretend to be an expert in those things, but largely for theological and exegetical reasons, I am decidedly a creationist, meaning I believe God created all things. And even more specifically, I would hold to a young earth view of creation, although that would be a different tier issue. Believing that God creates all things is a first tier issue. Believing the timeline or how is important, but a second or maybe even third tier issue. So I have strong views on all of these things, but it's that first belief. We believe, make God the Father, the maker of heaven and earth, right? That's a first tier issue. Obviously the author does not share that, and I wouldn't necessarily expect him to, but he doesn't share that. And it was interesting to me because obviously he holds to evolution, but two things kind of stood out. One was almost all of the examples he gives of evolution are what creationists would often describe as microevolution. In other words, it's not something from one species turning into another species as much as it is, a given plant, for example, developing certain characteristics consistent with itself. So, adapting to its environment in various ways, which of course we see happen all the time, right? Different breeds of dogs developing, different types of apple trees developing, whatever. But that idea of all this is coming from a common descent is not really explored in many ways. So what that means is, even for a young earth creationist who would be in a very different position than where Dr. Capon is coming from, there's still a lot you could learn even in those chapters on adaptation, because I just kind of had to make the mental switch. Okay, I have a different view of the timeline than he does, and he's assuming that this all descends from a common ancestor. He doesn't really prove that. That's not really the point of his book. I don't think it can be proved in the way that he would hold to it, but that doesn't ruin the book, right? That's kind of my point with this. It doesn't ruin the book. There's a lot you can take in to say, okay, I recognize this is microevolution within a given species. However, I do just have to say, kind of from, again, I'm creationist. Others would be not where I am, but in more of an intelligent design camp. Even just from an intelligent design perspective, it was very interesting. And I would just encourage you, whatever view you hold on these issues, watch how people talk about things, because Dr. Capon is a evolutionist, right? And so he believes this is just random mutations developing on their own, and yet he will talk about the intricate design, or he will ascribe agency to the plants or to the process, when on his terms, the plants don't have agency, and the process certainly doesn't have agency. He kind of takes these things, makes them abstractions, and puts them in the place of God, in essence. So again, I just can't help noticing those things, and I think that is itself a signal that the things we're talking about here are beyond just biology or botany. There are issues of philosophy, there are issues of theology, there are issues ultimately of our relationship with God. But anyways, that's kind of an aside, just me as a pastor thinking about this book. But all in all, I really did enjoy this book. If you are someone like me who has not delved into these things deeply and you're looking for a good introduction, I would highly recommend. I had the 3rd edition, but now the 4th edition is out, of Botany for Gardeners by Brian Capon.